Before Rome learned to fear the crack of thunder as a sign of the god's anger, it learned to fear silence. Silence meant Caligula was thinking. Silence meant someone, somewhere, was about to be summoned. And when the summons came for the virgins, women sworn to purity, protected by law, revered as living symbols of Rome's soul, even the marble statues of the city seemed to listen in dread. What was done to them was not written openly in history. It survived in whispers, in broken families, in rituals that suddenly changed. This is that story. At first, the rumors sounded impossible. Rome had rules older than memory, and among the strongest were those protecting sacred virgins. They were not simply women who had never known a man, they were living vows. Their bodies were considered extensions of the god's will, untouchable, beyond politics, beyond desire. To harm them was to invite divine punishment. Even kings before the Republic had feared that law. So when word spread that Emperor Caligula had taken an interest in them, people laughed nervously and told themselves it was another exaggeration. Caligula was already known for excess. His banquets lasted days, his jokes ended lives, his moods changed faster than the tides. He dressed as a god one morning and as a beggar the next, demanding worship either way. Senators bowed, not out of respect, but because they had seen what happened to those who did not. Rome had grown used to terror wearing a human face. But this felt different. This felt like a challenge not to men, but to heaven itself. The summons came quietly. A sealed message, carried by a trembling messenger, delivered to the custodians of the virgins. No threats were written, no explanations offered. Only an invitation to appear at the palace. For the emperor's inspection. Inspection was a word used for soldiers, for horses, for buildings. Never for sacred women. The custodians protested, citing ancient law. The messenger did not argue. He simply waited, eyes hollow, until they understood that refusal was not an option. On the night they were brought to the palace, Rome held its breath. Torches lined the corridors, their flames flickering as if unsure they wished to witness what was coming. The virgins walked in silence, their white garments glowing softly against the darkness. They were adults, trained since childhood to move with dignity, to speak little, to show no fear. Yet even discipline could not fully hide the tension in their steps. Caligula received them not on a throne, but reclining on a couch, surrounded by laughter that died the moment they entered. He studied them the way a collector studies rare artifacts, not with desire alone, but with curiosity mixed with contempt. To him, nothing was sacred unless he decided it was. And tonight he had decided to test the limits of Rome's oldest beliefs. He did not touch them. That was the first cruelty. Instead, he questioned them, one by one, about their vows. He asked them to describe the rituals of purity, the prayers they whispered alone at night, the fears they were never meant to voice. Each answer was met with a smile that suggested amusement rather than interest. It became clear he was not seeking knowledge. He was stripping meaning from their devotion, reducing centuries of faith to entertainment. Then came the commands. They were ordered to perform acts meant to mock their vows, not acts of physical violation, but of humiliation. They were made to speak words of praise to the emperor that echoed prayers once reserved for the gods. They were instructed to deny, aloud, the protections they believed in. To say, in front of witnesses, that their purity was not divine, but granted only by the emperor's mercy. For some, this was worse than death. The law had taught them that their worth lay in what they represented, not merely in who they were. By forcing them to publicly surrender that meaning, Caligula was killing something invisible but essential. And he watched closely to see who hesitated, who trembled, who obeyed too quickly. Each reaction was noted, remembered, stored away like a weapon for later use. When the audience ended, the virgins were dismissed without explanation. No blood had been spilled. No crime, in the legal sense, had occurred. Yet Rome woke the next morning feeling as if something had shifted. The custodians noticed changes immediately. The women were quieter. Their prayers were shorter. Some woke screaming from dreams they could not describe. Others stared at the temple walls as if expecting them to collapse. Caligula was not finished. He began to summon them individually, at irregular intervals, ensuring they could never feel safe. Sometimes he asked trivial questions. Sometimes he made them wait for hours, only to dismiss them without speaking. The uncertainty was deliberate. Fear, he believed, was more effective when it was unpredictable. Whispers spread through the city. People spoke of sacrilege, of curses soon to fall upon the empire. Others argued that perhaps the gods had already abandoned Rome, and Caligula was merely proving it. The virgins became symbols again, but now of vulnerability rather than protection. And that was exactly what the emperor wanted. As months passed, the true nature of Caligula's secret crimes became clearer. He was not driven by simple cruelty or desire, but by a need to dominate belief itself. He understood that power over bodies was temporary, but power over meaning could reshape an empire. By bending the virgins' vows without breaking the law outright, he showed Rome that even its most sacred institutions could be hollowed out from within. Some of the women were forced into roles that contradicted everything they had been taught. They were made to attend private gatherings where sacred symbols were used as props for mock ceremonies. Not to violate their bodies, but to violate their purpose. Each time, Caligula watched carefully, correcting their posture, their words, their expressions, as if rewriting their identities line by line. The psychological weight was crushing. A vow is not just a promise, it is a story one tells oneself every day to survive sacrifice. When that story was mocked and twisted, many of the virgins began to question their own reality. Were the gods silent because they were angry, or because they had never been listening at all? Caligula encouraged these doubts, planting them with casual remarks and laughter. Rome's elite noticed changes too. The rituals meant to ensure the city's safety felt empty. Omens were interpreted with panic instead of reverence. People began to avoid the temples at night. Faith, once a shared foundation, fractured into private fears. All of this traced back, quietly, to what was being done behind palace doors. Not all endured in silence. One of the virgins, older than the rest, began to speak in coded warnings during public ceremonies. Her words sounded like traditional prayers, but those who listened closely sensed despair beneath them. Caligula noticed as well. Instead of punishing her openly, he summoned her alone and praised her intelligence. He told her that survival depended on adaptation, not resistance. The next day, she was gone, sent away, officially for illness. No one ever saw her again. That disappearance broke something in the others. They realized then that death might indeed have been mercy. At least death preserved meaning. What they were living through erased it slowly, leaving them alive but unanchored. Some begged to be released from their vows. Others clung to them desperately, even as those vows were mocked repeatedly. Caligula's reign did not last forever. Madness, cruelty, and arrogance eventually united enough enemies to end his life violently. When he died, Rome erupted in relief. Statues were torn down. His name was cursed. People rushed to believe the nightmare was over. But the damage he had done to the virgins could not be undone so easily. Official records were altered. Certain ceremonies were changed. For tradition's sake. Some names vanished from rolls without explanation. Families avoided questions. The women who survived carried their experiences in silence, knowing that speaking openly would invite disbelief or blame. History preferred simpler villains and clearer crimes. What Caligula had done was harder to explain. Yet traces remained. In the way later emperors hesitated before challenging religious law. In the way priests spoke more carefully about purity and power. In the quiet understanding that cruelty does not always need violence to be devastating. Sometimes, it only needs authority and imagination. Caligula's secret crimes were not acts that could be pointed to in a courtroom. They were acts that poisoned trust, faith, and identity. He proved that an emperor could wound an empire without spilling blood, simply by forcing its most sacred symbols to kneel. And long after his name became a warning whispered to children, the virgins he broke remained the silent evidence that some horrors leave no scars the eye can see.